to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today we welcome back on the show Stephanie Moss. She's a medical student and she wrote the Kevin MD article, The Hidden Costs of Fully Covered Infertility Treatment. Stephanie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for those who didn't get a chance to listen to our first episode together, just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So the first time I wrote to Kevin MD, I was talking a lot about failing my step 1 exam, which was very heartbreaking, but it opened my eyes to the possibilities of the disabilities world and how individuals in medicine are rarely seen as able to have disabilities, mental or physical. So once I failed that exam, I actually ended up going to the disabilities office where I was able to get accommodations, which helped my future exam for step 1 and also for my future accommodations in my clinicals.
Now, since you wrote that article and appeared on my podcast, what has the response been? What was your journey since then?
Oh, it's been amazing. I've received so many amazing comments and personal messages from individuals across the country who have really either experienced it themselves where they failed an exam, didn't know what to do, and didn't even know that the disabilities office was even an option for them. Some individuals had before received accommodations for their MCAT exam or in college, but then when they submitted it to NBME, they got denied, whether because their mental or physical diagnosis wasn't enough for the NBME to qualify for accommodations. And it's been really interesting, and it's started to kind of develop a group of advocacy students and physicians who have started to realize that this is a problem in medicine and start talking about it more, sharing those experiences.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. So today we're here to talk about your latest Kevin MD article. This was published back in April. It's titled The Hidden Costs of Fully Covered Infertility Treatment. Now, for those that didn't get a chance to read your article, just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it.
Yeah. So it was during my second year of medical school that I actually went through an endometriosis surgery where we didn't know if we had endometriosis, but I had all the symptoms. So I went through and got a physician, a surgeon, and we went through the diminishing surgery where it was minimally invasive, and they determined that my fallopian tubes were clogged. And so if I ever wanted to have children in the future, I would have to go through some sort of infertility treatment. And that's where I really started to think like, I hadn't really thought about my fertility up to this point. You know, I had just been going medicine. My husband and I had talked about having kids maybe after residency, but all of a sudden I was put in a position where I had to figure out now, what are my options? Because of my condition was also, I had a diminishing reserve, which is actually pretty common for individuals who don't even have endometriosis, just in the physician world. A lot of the medical professionals, they get, by the time you finish your training, 7, 8, 10 years, you're like 30, 35. And by that time, just naturally, our ability to conceive does diminish as females. And so now if you add in medical conditions like endometriosis, that jumps up even higher the risk of infertility. And so I ended up getting in contact with an infertility doctor and starting on the journey of like, what does it look like to go through infertility treatment? What does it look like as a medical student, financially, emotionally? And the whole experience really surprised me. And that's why I really wanted to write the article, because I know that I am not alone with dealing with infertility. As I said, 1 in 4 female physicians have infertility, compared to 1 in 8 in just the general population, which is pretty significant. And then in my specific health condition, endometriosis, 50%. That's a pretty significant amount of individuals that are suffering from these conditions. And it's not really talked about in society, what it entails.
So Go into more details. Tell us some stories. You're a medical student and you were going down this pathway of infertility treatment. Can you share some stories about how you can illustrate that intersection?
Yeah. So at this point, let's see, it was about I think I started the journey in the spring
Hmm.
of 2020, which is also COVID time, on the beginning of the pandemic. It's also when I started studying for step one. So I have
Hmm.
all these things going on in my academic life and also in the social life. I ended up contacting in the midst of all that, I started the process of looking to see what infertility looked like. So I began by calling the fertility doctor that was highly recommended at my academic institution. And there was like, okay, wait, before we can even see you, here's a huge long list of questions you have to go to your health insurance and ask if they cover it, because we
Hmm.
will not see you. We don't want to waste your time nor our time. So here I go, call the health insurance, like any other call to the health insurance, multiple hours of my day.
Hmm.
And I went through each and every code they provided me. No, yes, yes, yes,
Hmm.
no. But overall, they provided yes. It is pretty much fully covered. You are very lucky. I remember that. Both the person on the other side of the phone for the health insurance, and then also when I went into the fertility doctor, all the nurses and the providers were like, oh my God, you have fully covered. That's a huge deal. Rarely can we get that for normal people. You're a medical student. So already I felt really confident and excited. I'm like, yeah, let's do this.
Hmm.
And that's where the journey started of, okay, now that we want to do this, first step is a test for hormones. So they went in, I did so many blood tests. I
Hmm.
feel like they tested for everything. Once they determined how my hormones were at, they were like, yes, it sounds good, but let's go through a follicle stimulation where they would give me hormones to try to make my ovaries as big as possible, produce as
Hmm.
many follicles. They would then remove them, and then I could decide to use some of them or freeze them. And this is where the interesting conversation came for a lot of people that I talked to, because normally when people go through this, they do it as an immediate situation. They remove the eggs, they put it right in their body. However, I had a unique situation where I didn't want to get pregnant right now.
Hmm.
I wanted to stay as a medical student. I had my step exam. I had at least 2 more years in academic medicine and then, of course, residency. So I decided, okay, I'm going to remove them. We're going to freeze them and keep them in the freezer at some faraway institution until we were ready to go through the actual the IVF process, where actually they would put them back in me.
Hmm.
Okay, so then came the situation of getting these injectable hormones, where I would inject myself and would actually stimulate these follicles, and that is where I hit the biggest stopping and struggle point, because there were 5 medications that were injectable, and these were ganirelix, follistim, menopur, leuprolide, and novarel. So those
Hmm.
5 injections kept saying they weren't covered.
Hmm.
And at this point, they had told us treatment, which this is part of the treatment, was going to be covered. And so this is where we went back and forth between multiple different pharmacies. Some pharmacies wouldn't even want to touch these medications because they just don't do infertility. That was too much. So they had special pharmacies that I went to that were just for infertility. They were called specialty pharmacies. And even when I went to the specialty pharmacies, after they added up, they're like, okay, it's going to be $10,000 for these 5 drugs. And I was like, wait, I thought my insurance was going to cover it. And they're like, no, it's being denied.
Hmm.
This is pretty typical. So that's where I started to do more research, go back and forth and back and forth. One representative said they were covered. So as I started to go into more of my step prep, I just put it on hold. I was like, insurance, you deal with it. I put in a pre-authorization. I did, and then I just waited. Let's see. And I guess, yes. And then they were denied. They were denied once, but then really interesting, out of the blue, after I took my first step exam, the one that I later failed, I got a call from my caseworker saying, I got them covered.
Hmm.
This was amazing. $10,000 would only go down to like $300 for the copay. So
Wow.
obviously super excited. was like, yes, get them shipped. And I went through. Now, I do want to mention why the insurance was saying they were not covered. They were saying that since they were an injectable medication, they were not covered under a pharmaceutical benefit. And the reason for this is usually injectables, they expect only a physician or a health professional in the office. So the pharmacy was able to send it to the office and then me go in, but that wasn't really feasible if I had to do these injections multiple times a day. And of course, my fertility, the office, they didn't want to do that. They didn't have the time for that either, but they possibly were covered under my medical pharmaceutical benefits. And so that's how we ended up like getting them covered, is not under pharmacy, under medical benefits. Because I had endometriosis, I was using infertility as a fertility treatment for my medical condition. That's how we got it. But as I've tried to do it now a second time later, it's not working. So this has been a very interesting journey to understand what it takes to get these medications.
So that's quite a story. I think that you clearly went through a lot of back and forth. It sounds like the first time you had it covered and you're having trouble the second time. It almost seems like there's an element of randomness to it almost. It seems like there's no real rhyme or reason to what they approve. Would you say, just talking to other people in your similar situation, that what you described is a fairly typical experience when it comes to trying to get infertility injectables approved?
Oh, yes, especially as I started talking to more individuals who experience infertility. It is just an expectation in the infertility world that people shell out 10, 30, 40, $50,000. And automatically that is a huge barrier, financial barrier, education barrier, time barrier for individuals to do this. And fortunately, this is where a lot of the advocacy has now come on through the American Women Association and actually an organization called Resolve, where they're actually working with individuals with infertility to actually go to the health insurances and say, this is a problem. These individuals need to get this treatment. They cannot just shell out money if they're already paying for their insurance. Insurance says it's going to cover it, but you can't say, oh, for these people you cover it, for these people you don't, with not any rhyme or reason. And it was interesting, as I tried to get the second round of infertility treatment medication, I actually sent a email similar to the letter to the Kevin MD article. I actually sent the letter to my academic institution, financial aid office, the health insurance company, to kind of telling my story. And I actually got a really interesting response from one of the health insurance kind of advocates, student advocates. And they're the ones who told me, you're in Illinois. It's actually a law. And this is after pretty much a year after I started going through this. And up to this point, never had I heard from the infertility doctor, from the insurance, from anyone, that this is actually a law in Illinois, a mandate that says that all infertility treatment all infertility treatment and procedures should be fully covered by any health insurance that is provided by a work environment that has more than 25 individuals. So, and this is not the only state. There are, there's a handful of other states that have laws that either have some sort of infertility preservation or just different additional qualifications or things to tell insurances that they need to cover it. So it is definitely really interesting and awesome that they have it. But even when I tell the insurance, there's still a struggle. So it's a work in progress.
So you're telling me that after all that back and forth and talking to your advocate and talking to your case manager, insurance company, and getting that first treatment approved, the second one maybe not. I don't even want to ask you how many hours have you spent on this. And you're a medical student studying for the STEP as well. Now that you discover there's a law that mandates that all infertility treatments be covered, and when you tell the insurance company that about this law and they're still giving you pushback, like what exactly are they saying? What's the reasons that they're giving you pushback for?
It's the same things as last time. They're kind of skating around. They're saying we'll look into it. Oh, give us more time. We will
Okay.
see. Some representatives, I said, they've given, the last representative that we had worked with said yes, but they needed the doctor to call the prescriptions like over the phone, which they had already done.
Hmm.
So just additional barriers that we had already followed. So I'm not sure. Like I said, it's a work in progress.
Hmm. So what's the path forward for you? Are we just kind of waiting to see what they say, continuing the back and forth? Is that essentially what it is?
Kind of. I believe the last thing I've done, I've asked my provider to recall in those prescriptions to a new specialty pharmacy that has been approved through the insurance to work with them for medical benefits, not just pharmaceutical benefits. So we'll see. I'm still waiting to hear back from them, and then if eventually when I do get those covered, hopefully, I'm still seeing when I can actually do it, because that is also an additional barrier and challenge. I had to take a leave of absence because of all the time, like you said, that it was impacting my life.
Hmm.
This procedure that I wasn't able to be a medical student and just study for stuff. And so now that I'm starting my third year of medical school, and with the knowledge that, okay, even if I do have this infertility medications, do I have a month to give away
Hmm.
for just this procedure? They say it's supposed to be just 2 to 3 weeks, but from my experience, it was a good month of injectable. It took me about a week of injectables just to get me at a baseline estrogen levels. And then as I actually was doing the injections to increase the amount of follicles, that was an additional 2 weeks. And then it was a good couple weeks just to recover because it was so painful. It made me just so weak, so tired. That's why I said fully covered. And that is actually someone reached out to me and mentioned, why didn't you talk about the emotional, the physical impact of infertility? And I want to say, yes, that does need to be stated. There is so much that infertility impacts. This was just one additional thing that I didn't expect. I was expecting the emotional and physical like struggle, but this was something that just added
Sure.
to the cost that I wanted to be known.
We're talking to Stephanie Moss. She's a medical student. She wrote the Kevin MD article, The Hidden Costs of Fully Covered Infertility Treatment. Stephanie, for those other medical students, residents, and physicians for that matter, who are also going through the infertility journey, after you reflect on your experience thus far, any pieces of wisdom that you could share with them to make their process a little bit easier?
Yeah, I say first of all, it's so important to go to your insurance and be very clear and write down what they say, write down which representative you talk to, write down they always give you a code, have that in writing of what they said was covered. Once you're good to go, also check out what your state, if there's any mandates out there that can support you in your adventure. We like to tell all medical students and residents that it's important to start that conversation early if you do have a partner, or even with yourself, and realize that if you want to have the choice later on, you do have to start having some family planning in your life beforehand, especially as you go forward with this medical career.
And my final question, any take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I think it's important to state that this is not a unique condition. This is very common. This is 1 in 8 individuals have infertility, 1 in 4 physicians, female physicians, and this is something that needs to be talked about, and people need to become aware of it and actually fight for the rights.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your story and coming back on the show. Thanks again for your
Thank you
time
so
and insight.
much.